starting point. Okay, so we're recording now?
Yeah, I just recorded it. Just started recording so we don't lose more. I also made you a co-host, right?
Yes, I think so.
I just broke my glasses again. So I'm having a hard time seeing.
Okay, so you should be able to see. Yeah, we were thinking for this presentation, I'm going to go over the rest of the slides that I prepared, which is only like 5 or 6. And then we can talk about things that were unclear previously. And I think, Gabriel, you created this nice, basically like a note-taking system for us to go through every concept that I've covered in the presentation, and to just kind of jot down our thoughts, right, for each. So this might be a good way to organize any.
Please just go to the bottom of it, just so people see the really weird diagrams they make at the end.
Yeah, these are all diagrams from the book, and they're really nice, actually.
Yeah, when the little houses start to appear, then things get really crazy. Like this is all recognized. Then like some weird creatures.
Yeah, I like thinking of them as UFO. And now that we've watched Nope, now everything here is this is a UFO diagram.
Yeah, but these last ones are just.
This is crazy, yeah. Like doorways into some crazy world.
I love this last one. Like, and now you have like a company. Like, just now it's everything should be clear.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so I tried to avoid, but I basically copied their design for the diagrams. But I try to avoid some of these like more complicated ones in the these Figma slides. Yeah, so where should we start? I guess last time I introduced co-regulators, but I think it's a good place to start again. So as we get further into the book, I think we get more closer to the idea of actual organizing tasks, things that you should do if you're organizing or trying to like craft an organization. And I think co-regulators are basically the name for something like a meaningful set of organizing elements that are trying to function to achieve some kind of goal. Whereas before, you have things that are kind of like an ecosystem, everything is kind of doing its own thing. With co-regulators, you start to get the idea of like goal-driven organization, let's say. So here it's a subsystem of the evolutive system whose components act together. Co-regulators can retrieve information from memory. They can put stuff back into memory, and that stuff is later on we'll talk about it. They're called records. And the interaction between all the co-regulators of the system determine the overall strategy of the system. And if you remember, the strategy is the functor. It's essentially the functor that maps the evolutive system from one time frame to another. So this can just happen through a random process, right? Like a system is just evolving randomly and you don't know anything about its future state. But by understanding how the co-regulators work together, you can start to understand what is the overall like path it's taking. So I think it's less important for us as STP to care about like prediction, using this formalism to predict where a system will go. But it is important to understand how the co-regulators influence the evolution, basically. So co-regulators have things called agents. Agents are just objects, like in our original category, right? The synchronic view, we have objects and arrows between the objects. So an object in time is a component, and the components within a coregulator are called agents. These agents together have an internal model of the world called the landscape. If I had to say, like, on the earlier topic of the difference between MES and second order cybernetics, I would probably point to three concepts that I think distinguish it. One would be the multiplicity principle, which is definitely something new, I think. I'm not aware of it ever really discussed in cybernetics, although emergence is probably discussed. Fractures, I think, is a pretty unique idea, which we'll go into in the next few slides. And then I think the landscape is the other idea that's very unique and very close to our turf of phenomenology, because the system itself doesn't have one way of looking at it. Every coregulator has its own way of looking at it, and it is the gaps between the landscapes that play a decisive role in how the strategy is decided, and how fractures are resolved. So landscape is a really important concept. And then there is this notion of admissible procedures, which basically the whole end of chapter 8 is all about procedures and procedural memory. I didn't have a chance to put that into the slides, but it's also really concrete for us how to model the creation of new ways of acting. Like when we talk about in STP the action space, I think we're talking about what are the admissible procedures at a given conjuncture, right? What are things you can do, and that is tied up with memory. It's tied up with discovery or experimentation. So you may start out with a small set of admissible procedures, but you have to develop and complexify that set. But yeah, we can talk more about that when we get into the discussion on memory.
I actually have one question that connects to what you said about the multiplicity principle. So yes. I was really excited by that concept. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the ideas from Graham Priest's work on paraconsistent logic and dialetheism. But that aside, what I was sort of just thinking just now when you were comparing it to cybernetics is what would the MES way of accounting for Ashby's law of requisite variety? Are you sort of familiar with that? I think Nunes talks a little bit about it, as something that when you have a living system, in order for it to account for the proliferating variety of its environment, that it needs to balance itself against that with a kind of requisite regulating variety. I don't know, for some reason, it kind of just occurred to me that might have that can be connected to emergence, that might have something to do with maybe not directly the multiplicity principle, but something else involved in MES. I don't know. I'm curious more about some of those similarities and differences, if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with requisite variety, but there is basically two buckets, I will say, that two concepts kind of play the same role. One is this interaction between the co-regulators. That's kind of, it seems to me, like a regulative thing that is based on no one co-regulator can decide everything. And then the multiplicity principle, I think, is a small scale version of that, which kind of plays the same role in that you can't decompose an object into just one set of factors. Yeah, so I think I definitely agree there's some resonance with paraconsistent logic there, maybe, that it's seems to be this kind of obstacle to determining the causes of a system, because they're trying to get away from, the authors of MES are trying to get away from this mechanistic approach to systems. So this is like their way of accounting for goal-driven action.
And
yeah, I am interested.
One more thought, if you don't mind. One more thought I just thought I would bring in with respect to the co-regulators. It's giving me like that very sort of ecological vibe, like the way that, I guess you could potentially think of like how Karatani and Suchida talk about the entire Earth as like a heat engine. Like you could look at the co-regulators like of the Earth itself as a system, or like any of other sort of like material cycles. Like I think it would be really interesting to follow up on like how MES might connect to ecology. If you have any thoughts on that too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the whole the power of this formalism, if we were going to apply it to things like climate change, is it offers us a multi-causal model for these systems. There's not only one cause for something like climate change, right? There's many different factors and they're all entangled together. And that involves political factors, that involves natural factors. And we need a model that's able to cross those boundaries easily. Like the interface between how we organize ourselves as humans and how nature organizes itself, which is like the big theme of Bogdanov as well. This tension, I think MES is the right tool for describing that interface and describing how stuff like heat flows between two things, but information as well. But yeah, we want to be able to describe things like kinship relations, legal relations, and fictions that we create. These are all things that need to be somehow in the same logical space. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but I basically think it's a really flexible way to describe interaction.
No, I think that's really helpful. I really like that too. I agree.
Yeah, Gabriel.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think that the law of requisite variety is a version of something which I find very amazing. I think Ashby proposed it. Remember when we were obsessed with that good regulator theorem? It was the paper. It was a long time ago. We were reading this paper that every key is a good model of the lock.
Oh yeah.
Remember that. That's the good regulator theorem, which is like a good regulator must be in a sense a model of the thing it regulates, right? But there is a connection between this and the idea of requisite variety, which is the idea that I think that a current, I'm not sure if that's how it's called, but I know like a more recent version of this is the idea that it's called requisite complexity, which is a system that regulates a complex system must be as complex as it is, at least, right? You cannot have a simple regulator for a complex system. So you need to match regulation, which is, like the same way that the amplitude of variety of a regulator must match the amplitude of variety. Like there is a correlation between quantity of variation in a system and the regulator of that system. I think that's kind of the ballpark of it, right?
No, I think that's exactly it. It's Ashby's law. Like it was Ashby's idea, the requisite variety law. And itself, that was actually inspired by like the theories of homeostasis that were just being developed in biology at that time. Like, what is it that actually makes a system functionally homeostatic? There's potentially some interesting connections to psychoanalysis there too that I've kind of been thinking about, but I won't get this too off track.
But well, that would be interesting. But like I think that this is a really, really good point to kind of make this comparison between these systems, the memory evolutive systems, and kind of cybernetics. For example, the requisite complexity principle is a quantitative principle of let's say it's a quantity of its complexity in terms of quantity. I think that here complexity is more qualitative in the sense that you actually have, for example, the multiplicity principle, which I agree, it has this, I don't know, dialectical vibe because it's two things, but it's one thing, right? they kind of base the whole idea of complexity on the idea that one multiple has two patterns, but it's the same multiple. It has one cone, like one kind of point of unity, but actually that unity is a unity of two separate things, but those two separate things actually refer to the same thing. So there is this whole thing about it, right? But I think that two aspects of this, and Dennis, correct me if I'm totally off the mark here, but one is that I find this refreshing because it's a very qualitative take on complexity. So you can ask questions of not how much, but what form, like what are these two patterns that are two separate but refer to the same thing. So you don't need to simply talk about complexity in terms of degree of difference, like a lot of difference, a lot of variety or less variety. You can talk about qualitatively different types of variety. And for the stuff that we've been doing, that's really necessary, because though there is a quantitative counterpart, for example, to the difference between types of society, like there are really interesting studies that show that, well, there is something like an informational threshold to how much information can be integrated in a system where gift economy is the ruling economy, ruling social form. Societies need to be kind of small, and empires can be much bigger and they still can integrate information, and capitalist societies can be even bigger. So you can have a quantitative approach, but that's a very kind of teleological, stepwise theory, and our theory is more like a building blocks one on top of the other, right? We think that these things are together at the same time. You have like gift economies mixed with state economies mixed with commodity forms. So to talk about that, you would need a qualitative way of distinguishing these things, because they need to be occurring at the same time. They're not just degrees of variation and, let's say, defined by the quantity of information they integrate. So the take from the memory evolutive systems has that benefit of being slightly more qualitative about, you don't need to assume that you have, like, you need less of that jargon of pure differentiation and, you know, difference as such to talk about complexity. You can talk about complexity by having quite determinate things, but right, you can have two determinate patterns, but if they're caught up in relations in certain ways, qualitatively distinguished ways, then you will have complexity of a certain type. So that's very interesting for us, and I find that a bit different from the cybernetic thing. And then the second thing, which Dennis, I really wanted to hear what you think of it. Like, my impression is that the only reason why they propose the multiplicity principle, as if it's nothing, because like you can find something like this in a lot of philosophy and Hegelian and Marxists, but it's always like conflict, contradiction, two that is one, that is two. It's like a weird kind of puzzle in your mind how these things can be the case. Mm-hmm. But in the formal machinery they are using, which is category theory, like when I say I have, you know, A and B and I have some relation between the two, the grammar allows me to say at the same time that there is one relation between the two and there are infinite relations between the two. I don't know which they are because I can't distinguish them without adding more structure. So it's very natural to talk about, you know, you have like a space with some nodes and there are many types of connections between them that we cannot tell apart. So that there are multiple graphs that you can kind of extract, distinguish in the same kind of space of relations. That's kind of...
If I could just cut in here, I want to say, I realized, I just got this moment of realization, Dennis, you might know this. In Brain of the Firm, Stafford Beer explicitly talks about this. I'd forgotten, but now I'm like remembering this concept of anastomosis, right? So he talks about specifically a river delta. And the idea is that if you take like one drop of water in a river delta, like which particular path is it taking, you don't know. It's like all sort of, you know, these different interconnections that, and he also frames it in information theory terms, in terms of like, on the one hand, it actually does sort of exceed our literal mental processing power of information. Like, so we have to use heuristics in addition to algorithms. That's one of the things he brings up. But like, I think there's potentially a way to interpret that kind of like anastomotic concept. Like, I think it's very similar to the multiplicity principle, which seems like a less metaphorical way of approaching it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think they all share in common this idea of like a negative definition of complexity, which is like Gabriel was saying also, it's not quantitative, it's quality, it's I almost want to say it's like topological, it's spatial, like an obstacle to in a space, like a hole in it, that prevents certain things, certain procedures from happening. Actually, one of the first texts that we talked about in STP that I presented was on system generativity or something, generative systems by Adam.
Adam
Adam, yeah. And he has the exact same thing. He had this idea of like complexity is a veil over some bit of information that breaks a certain transitivity property. So like it's a loss of something that creates complexity, not necessarily a positive feature. And I feel like the same thing happens in MES, where you lose something in the ability to reduce a system down to its parts. And that is the approach, like that's the approach they take to describe complexity. And maybe, I don't know, on the face of it, that sounds like just another way of saying the same thing. It's complex because you can't reduce it to simple parts. But I think, yeah, the way they do it is really interesting. Also, yeah, the way the arrows work, maybe this is going too far in direction, but like it doesn't, the multiplicity principle doesn't, let me just change the slide actually to go back to that. In this example, right? In this picture of the multiplicity principle, there are no arrows between the two like slices of the same object, the two the degenerate object. There's like two patterns that go into it, right? But then there's no links, collective or clusters between these two patterns. But that's only true insofar as they don't commute with the rest of the diagram. There can actually be connections between them, but it's because of the constraints of these arrows that no links suffice to connect them. So it's almost like by adding enough arrows, you start to like filter out the possible links. And that's what allows this multiplicity principle to reveal itself. But I don't know, it's maybe that's a bit outside of that's more a feature of category theory, like the way that arrows work.
Yeah, but I do think it's relevant. I mean, I think it would be worth it trying to understand at some point. I mean, it connects even to the first issue we were discussing. Why is it that category theory became such an interesting tool for people trying to deal with like biology? Because I mean, cybernetics was around. Why didn't these people just continue in that direction? So they were aware, you know, Rosen was very much kind of friends and in debate with cybernetics, and he admired those guys. So why did he feel like he needed something else? The same with Ehresmann and Memory Evolutive Systems. They constantly reference cybernetics and points and so on. They do make a distinction that cybernetics is not the proper field to discuss memory because it's too feedback based and too little memory based, or at least not based, but wouldn't have the tools. But I have the impression that there is something like my intuition, which I think it's a Aristotle versus Plato sort of problem. You know, Aristotelians, in the end of the day, I think they think that ultimately, like, what life is will drive what politics is. And Platonists think that what politics is will ultimately drive what life can be. Like, it's up for grabs what a good life is. It's, you know, the concept of justice is gonna solve that problem. And then we'll be something, and that thing will be also a way of living, and it will have changed how beings exist. Whereas in Aristotle, it seems like, guys, we should strive to be in continuity with with living creatures and life in general. Like that gives us a hint of what justice might be like. And so it has a more of a transitive feel between biology and politics. Like we should expand, like even energetically, talking about climate change and the kind of Earth systems discussions as Anna brought up. It would be more like, let's look at the energetic point of view, and that will tell us how to deal with the political life of inhabiting the planet. Whereas I think the Platonic view would invert that. It's a pity that Rafael was not here. I was talking to him about this earlier. It would invert. It would say like, ultimately, if you try to extend that sort of view towards politics, you get like survival. You don't get actual life. You kind of need to invert it. Of course, you need to, not die and not kill everything to lead the good life. But there is something that's not transitive. And I do have the feeling that category theory is really good at binding together things which are not transitive, but still treat them in continuity. Like Rosen is not trying to kind of make form emerge out of underlying phenomena. He just says, I can cut it off here, forget about matter, and just take organization. These guys are also doing something similar. Like they're not trying to explain to us how things emerge, like how two patterns emerge from the same substrate. They just say, if they do, then you get something, right? It's a bit more qualitative in that sense. I don't know. It's a weird connection, like Plato, Aristotle to this discussion. But I feel that's where my heart goes. Like I feel like that's the discussion. That's where it leads back to, Aristotelian cyberneticians and Platonic category theorists.
Yeah, that's it. It's a nice formulation.
Shout out to Rafael. It's my attempt to further lure him into the mathematics.
Yeah, I was sad that he couldn't join. I wanted to hear his views. Okay, so let's go back to. Okay, so we have this co-regulators. The kind of the dialectics. They even use this term, like dialectics of the interactions between the co-regulators. That's what determines the direction of the system. So if we understand how the co-regulators interact, we get a really good insight into this movement, right?
But can I just ask one question I forgot to ask? Like the co in co-regulator is not the co in like co-con, co-limit. It's just in the sense that they're cooperative or they're just partial.
Yeah, they're not clear on that. I also had that question. I don't know for sure, but I feel like they're just because there are many of them, so they regulate together, not necessarily because. But there are a lot of co-limits. Like they are made up of co-limits of things. So yeah, it'd be interesting if they ever talk about regulators as opposed to co-regulators. Then we have to think about it again. Yeah. So then we also talked about the three stages of subjective time for a co-regulator, right? You have a decoding phase, a regulation phase, and an encoding phase. The decoding and the encoding correspond very closely to Rosen's nice picture of how like formal systems encode and decode things from natural systems. So co-regulators kind of have that going on. They're like a system unto themselves, which takes some information, digests in some way, and then sends actions out. And this actually looks very familiar, right, in the cybernetics point of view of inputs, and then there's a feedback as well, and then an actuator step with the encoding. But I think what's interesting here is they have so much emphasis on the temporality and the synchronization or the lack of synchronization between these steps that I think it starts to be more it starts to go in a different direction than cybernetics. But yeah, you have a delay to every action, right? Links don't just happen instantaneously. A link, even if you draw the arrow in a synchronous manner, when you kind of unfold it in time, it takes a certain delay before arrows can commute. both vertically and horizontally. So you actually end up having a bunch of diagonal arrows. It starts at one point and then it kind of the end point of the arrow has to go like a little bit forward in time. So you have these diagonal arrows instead of straight vertical ones. And that becomes really important. Right. So that one important thing of that is that you have a duration of a single step, which is the minimum lag time it requires to do all three of these things: decoding, regulation, and coding. And that also determines it's like kind of what a co-regulator can be aware of. If two co-regulators have two radically different subjective times, then effectively you can say that one co-regulator is kind of invisible to the other one, right? And that just makes sense. Like if one co-regulator is happening on the order of milliseconds, it's basically going to be invisible to like the co-regulator of like a mountain or something, like an ecosystem that is taking thousands of years or hundreds of years to change itself. And that's covered in the book as well, like the interaction between these co-regulators of different different subjective times. Yes, I'll probably go a little faster here. So anticipation is the thing where you build a landscape based on information that the co-regulator receives. It's another category. From that category, it can create an anticipated landscape, which is what its landscape will become once it applies certain procedures. So there's this whole, during the regulation phase, you have to select admissible procedures. You have this action space of possible things you can do. You choose, as a co-regulator, you choose which procedure you want to do, and then you apply that procedure to your landscape to yield the anticipated landscape, which is like your expectation of what happens after you have applied your landscape. So there's this modeling of time within the landscape, within the co-regulator. And then once you've decided your procedure, you can send that to the effectors of the evolutive system. Those are like the components of the evolutive system that actually can decide the strategy. And then it's possible that two co-regulators send two opposing procedures to the same effector. And I used here the example of like a lawsuit. You have two parties trying to interact with the effector of the legal system. Obviously, the legal system is what will decide in the end which of these two parties, which procedure will succeed. One procedure fails, one procedure succeeds. But this is probably more, the fact that it's a binary thing, like either it succeeds or doesn't, is probably more a feature of the fact that it's mode B. We can also think of effectors that integrate procedures more seamlessly. So like, it's not just a matter of one party wins and the other party loses, but you can create like a composite procedure that is the outcome of multiple opposing procedures. And then when that happens, you can store that into memory. So you can actually track emergent phenomena, emergent procedures that did not exist before. So that's also a possibility. But anyway, it all gets traced back to this idea of anticipation. You can anticipate the future state of your actions and then use that to make a decision.
So I really wanted to share something here. I actually took a little screenshot from a presentation about the viable system model. I was just looking at, sent that to the chat. So you can open it now or later, but I just wanted to say, if you go back to the last slide, it's actually, there's a really remarkable similarity. So like the decoding of the receptors, that's like the function of the environment. the regulation to the effectors. That's sort of like what Beer calls like the operation. And then the encoding to the memory is what he calls the meta system. And it's like, it's not quite as elaborate as the MES, but I'm realizing like it's a very, very similar set of principles, but sort of just simplified and like organized in a slightly different, I guess, less formalized way.
It looks really
Yeah,
similar.
exactly. This is really cool. Yeah, this is exactly the type of thing. Like it's kind of like an open system that's like interacting with its environment. Yeah, the muscles are kind of like the effectors. So you would be sending procedures, like the arrow that goes from the brain to the muscles would be the procedure. And then yeah, I guess in this case the brain would be the co-regulator. I don't know if actually I'm not sharing this picture, but no. Gabriel, did you have?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. I'm still struggling. I mean, I get the general view of like. Actually, I really like this about chapter 6 of this book, that they start with like this ridiculous definition of a co-regulator, makes like the most abstract general thing, like, yeah, you know, you have co-regulators, they regulate stuff, and they say like, okay. And then when you get to the middle of the chapter, first they give a definition, which I think it's very interesting for us, because they make a comparison of co-regulators with this thing, I forgot how it's called. It's the epistemo-praxeologic loop, defined by Robert Vallet, which is a combination of observation, analysis, and action, which pretty much sounds like intelligibility, composition, and interaction.
Yeah.
And they say, yeah, so okay, so like once you get like, they correlate this with these 3 points, right? The co-regulator it has how did they call it? Yeah, it has 3 things it needs to perform, right? It's an internal observation, a regulation, which is selecting objectives, right, and admissible procedures, and then a control function, which is to evaluate the results of the effect. They kind of correspond to the arrows there in that basic structure Anna shared, as you were saying, right? And then they go on in the chapter to say, you want to know how these things work. And then after like 10 pages of a lot of headache, they get to that image. I mean, if you could just go to that Figma file, just image 6.6. It's just there you go, just below this one, right? This huge one here. Yeah. This is their version of the basic structure that Anna shared. Like this is what you need just to say somebody perceived, like some system perceived something, made an observation, selected a procedure, affected it, and then evaluated it, right? So ultimately, this complete image here from 6.6, this is, let's say, the most kind of expanded formal version we've seen of somebody trying to account for, let's say, a dynamic way in which observing, interacting, and constraining are connected, right? In time, like not even in an abstract sense. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that I mean, their version sounds so fucking complicated.
You glossed over this really fast, but you mentioned something about like praxeology or whatever, and then you connected it to the composition, intelligibility, interaction triad. Could you like just send like what you said to the chat? Like I want to write that down and like check that out.
I looked into it today. Like they quote this Robert Vallet guy who is a French like father of cybernetics kind of. And I know that I was looking into this, and in the 80s and 90s, he started trying to apply this to social studies in terms of this kind of loop that would be both practical, epistemological, and analytic, right? How these 3 things are connected, and they refer to him just before they go into like a more detailed analysis of what is a co-regulator doing for them. So the reason why I mention is that like if we just take them at their word and the basic analogies that seem to come from this, that how they define co-regulators, both by, okay, depending on how they compose, they are the co-regulators of some of, they can make some observations, they'll have some landscapes rather than others, right? So depending on how they are composed, they will also be able to select some procedures rather than others, and they'll be able to evaluate the effect of those procedures and rather than other evaluations, right? So there seems to be this is the place in the book thus far where I felt like there was the clearest kind of Rosetta Stone to connect with the concepts that we were working on before, you know, because until now I was having a hard time knowing, like, okay, where should we start if we want to start drawing analogies between this formal stuff and the stuff we've been doing. And I feel like this might be the place. Mm-hmm. Because now it's like with the co-limits and like, you have graphs and they have this kind of synthetic point of view. It's very compositional. It sounds dynamic because it's graphs, but they're not really dynamic. It's very synchronous, right? It's just structure. This is the point where you add the co-regulators are pretty much the axes between the synchronous and the diachronic, right? They are the ones that are gonna, let's say, select what the passage of time, like what the transition will make to the system. So what procedure we're gonna try, right? So they are kind of the actors of this time step, to the point that they even define the subjective time is defined on the co-regulators, not the inverse, right? There is like propagation times, but those things are objective. They only acquire the subjective sense of interiority because the co-regulators have their own time and their own temporal dimension to their procedure. So it seems really, really, really central. And precisely at the point of this very, very central concept of co-regulators that is bringing together the whole discussion on hierarchy and complexity, which was synchronous, with this kind of strategic view of temporal unfolding, right? That's where they make a connection that sounds very close to the type of concept we were looking into. Like, so I just wanted to point that out, that probably this is worth pursuing, you know, that the steps of a co-regulator, which are kind of concomitant phases, right, of observation, analysis, and action, that they themselves connect to this epistemo-praxeologic loop, and they even divide it into, it's epistemic because it's the formation of the referent for the co-regulator. So it's creating what the co-regulator sees, right? It's also has some praxis to it because it will select an objective on the landscape and a procedure, right? And then it's also analytic because it will evaluate the result and compare and create an anticipated landscape and so on, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's very interesting that it just confirms that this seems to be really the key point that we should use to make these bridges, I guess. Then I just wanted to point out to this drawing because I mean, it just sounds like there's a lot to understand before the bridge can be made.
Yeah, the drawing is very intimidating, but I think the idea is pretty cool. Like it's pretty clear. Also, you basically have these loops that are happening at every time scale. There's these praxeological loops. Yeah, at the tiniest time scales all the way up to whatever the total system time, and you're basically composing time loops, or you're composing these smaller loops to form bigger loops, and something can go wrong in that composition, right? It's not necessarily that you preserve every information, all the information from smaller loops into the larger loops, and then this idea of since everything is a pattern in this grammar, the outcome is that you should have something like a way to complexify or make more complex your memory. I think that would be like one way to think of the outcome.
Also, just one question here, man. Like in this drawing, Are the co-regulator inside the memory?
No, it's just accessing it.
Okay, memory is just this little shards of something on top here.
Yeah. Yeah, you can think of the CR boxes as being like floating above the memory.
Okay.
So they're not inside memory, they're like on a different axis or whatever. They're floating above it.
That's the only difference, right, between the basic structure of the cybernetic system NSENT and this one. I mean, it goes straight to that point we made before about cybernetics kind of basically focusing on feedback rather than like this internalization of the environment, right? Because there was like an environment that is shared by the brain and the muscles, and the brain and the muscles relate, but there is no, let's say, model of the environment inside of the brain, right? Like here, like the memory is kind of something that is being sedimented through in between the, right, the relation with the outside, which is the environment. Like you have an inner environment, which is not the same as.
One thing that you do see in like a lot of the lit on VSM that I've been exposed to so far is they talk about how like the entire thing is sort of recursive in every direction. But to some extent, I think that's maybe a little bit of a cop out, like having to explain like how like memory would actually, you know, create that kind of other model. Like it would be different. It wouldn't just be like, you know, VSM, like endlessly one direction or another. It almost actually reminds me of the Aristotle-Plato distinction that you made before. Again, like the sort of infinite divisibility versus like, you know, the way that forms function.
We should call this book Rememorative Evolutive Systems, like in Plato, you know?
Oh yeah.
Rememoration. Like.
Mnesis, evolutive systems. Yeah, what was I going to say about this? Yes, I was going to use the example. I think I talked about it later in the later slides too, of like extended mind. I think that's also a nice area where we can distinguish memory from co-regulators. Like imagine like you have a bunch of ants. And they lay out the pheromone trails so that they know where to go later. The memory would be those pheromone trails, and the ants themselves would be like, or maybe groups of ants would be co-regulators. So they're able to use the memory like a resource, but they are not the same as the memory, right? And they have their own landscape independent of the memory, which is the landscape would be kind of like their immediate kind of everything that they can sense and be aware of, but the pheromone trails can be very like, you know, spread across, you know, not miles or whatever that the ants cannot directly perceive. And the same thing for, you know, social systems where you have like traditions and rites of passage and stuff. That's a memory that human individual may not feel totally comfortable in or understand all the, you know, the symbolic weight of their own culture, but that's a memory that's waiting to be accessed, waiting to be used.
You know, like I just realized something. It's actually quite interesting that you know, Hegel defined, and like he made this distinction between animals and plants, saying that plants are animals with their intestines outside, right? And then animals have intestines on the inside. So that's why they carry they carry their roots everywhere. And then they need to put the earth into their mouths to actually reach the roots. But the memory is still outside, right?
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, you get like a certain change in types of biological systems in terms of how much they also put the memory to the inside, right? So you have put the intestines in, then you put your memory in.
Yeah, carry it with you, but you don't have to. No.
And then for Freud, the problem is that humans have the intestines in, memories in, but thinking outside, right? Thoughts are still outside. So probably the next iteration, whatever comes, will have thought on the inside. Maybe that's a nice definition for a communist society. It has thought on the inside.
Yeah.
Rather than externalities, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we should talk more about memory. I have like a couple slides on it. I think that's where a lot of interesting stuff happens here, and also the connection with psychoanalysis. I'm really excited to explore that one day. But basically, this is connected to everything that we've ever wanted to study. So there's just so many different paths we can go that it's a bit overwhelming. So I'll just try to stick to the slides for now. So yeah, anticipation. Learning is a thing, right? So yeah, like we were just saying, have this loop where you have this anticipated landscape, and then you can compare the anticipated landscape with the landscape of the next step, because landscapes are stored in memory, so, or at least some aspect of the landscape is stored in memory. So you can pull that back out on the next step and reconstruct like what you thought you did, or what you thought the outcome of your procedure was in the previous step. You can pull that out of memory and now compare it to the landscape you have now. And this is done through this difference functor, which allows you to tell the difference between the two, right? Because they're categories. You use a functor to map them, and that map contains the information of their difference. If it's an isomorphism, then, or like a invertible functor, then you succeeded. Basically, the procedure had the effect that you thought it would have. But if it's not an invertible functor, if there's some information lost or something happened, then you can use that difference as you can record that difference in your memory. So that's what the arrow coming out of the landscape on the right going into the memory, that's the learning process of taking the difference functor and storing that as a record. And yeah, one more thing on memory is that memory is a evolutive system itself. So it has multifold objects. It has complexity. So when we talk about, like, it's not just simply learning the environment, you're also building objects to serve as the co-limits of things that you would encounter in the landscape. So if you think, like, you encounter the same obstacle on the road every day, but that thing that you encounter can be a little different every time. You can create in your mind or in your memory something that stands for the whole class of things that you might encounter. Maybe one day it's like a broken car, or a car broke down on the road. Another day it's like animals walking across the road. These are all obstacles. They all share some kind of similar characteristics. So your memory can evolve to connect those things under the same, let's say, same object. But yeah, so learning is basically this complexification of your memory. Okay, we briefly touched on this, that procedures don't have to be integrated. There can be different ways, different techniques of deciding between procedures. So you have these two co-regulators both competing for the same effector, like the example of the lawsuit. You can basically choose in your model what is the meta procedure of deciding between the procedures. Maybe you integrate them, maybe you choose one winner and one loser. They mention game theory as one example of integration algorithm. So game theory would basically would allow us to figure out like optimum strategies, like Pareto optimal or Nash equilibrium, whatever. And that would be one way that the effector works. But we can think of other ways. Maybe like found in nature, that takes the way that different agents in nature might interact and then integrates them. And yeah, so I mean, it's very open what you want to plug into this effector. Different frameworks can achieve this same achieve this same role. Right. In other words, there's no general solution to the integration problem. Right. Just as earlier, there's no guarantee that a binding problem can be solved. So there could, it could also be that you just cannot integrate them at all, and the effector has to ignore.
Is that a theorem? Do you remember that there is no solution, or is it did they just say this?
I think they just say this. I don't remember if they prove it somehow. I think they're just saying, like, we don't care what the integration procedure looks like. It can be anything. But yeah, but this also has to do with complexification of the memory, because once you integrate two procedures that have never happened at the same time before, you get a new procedure that can be stored in memory. So, like, if you're playing music, you've never played music with someone else, or you never play with this particular person, you don't know what it's like to play music with them. So you don't have a procedure for how to harmonize with them. So before, you were playing by yourself, then you play with them, and then you figure out a way to play, like, harmonize. You understand their style, and you, in that interplay with the other musician, you've created a new procedure, which is distinct from how you play music by yourself. That would be an example of integration. I would like to think of this one as almost like the binding problem, but diachronic. It's like the binding problem in time, whereas the original binding problem was just synchronic. It was like, you have some pattern. How do you combine that into one thing? I think Efren joins up. Just admit him.
Excellent.
Okay, and let's see what else here. Okay, the idea of fractures is really important. So we have these loops happening at all different timescales, and when the anticipated landscape no longer matches the actual landscape, you have the smallest version of a fracture, and that's usually okay. When you have a small fracture, it just means there's some small difference in the anticipated effects of your procedure. But when this fracture starts to persist over multiple steps, not just one step, but it's like a continuous problem, that's when you get this interesting other form of emergence, right? It's not exactly the same as the multiplicity principle, but it's like emergence of unanticipated effects. So the example I try to give here, which I didn't really put that much, like, I put a lot of effort into drawing this, but I didn't put a lot of effort into formalizing this enough, which is, I wanted to say, like, we can model overproduction in capitalism as a fracture, right? Because there's this kind of anticipated, there's a function of anticipation in knowing, like, how much to produce, right? Every individual capital is trying to guess what is the optimal production rate. And in normal cycles, this is fine, right? Everything you produce, you can sell. But Marx identifies, like, because the wage relation makes it so that workers don't have enough money to buy all the products they produce, the net effect over time is that you have overproduction. And this is the nature of capitalist crises, is that you produce too much because no one can afford, not the people as a whole cannot afford the product, right? And I think there's some, basically, like, a way to describe this in terms of fractures.
I love that example. I just want to say, like, because, like, crisis theory is a hugely controversial thing in a contemporary Marxist political economy. There are so many debates about, like, I don't know if y'all have seen like that blog critique of crisis theory is like really interesting to read about like all of the different debates about it. I feel like this is super potentially helpful on like numerous fronts to clarifying. I also really appreciate like, I mean, I guess maybe for some people it's not, it's kind of a no-brainer that like, oh yeah, Marx talked about overproduction and like Karatani talks about overproduction. I think Karatani's crisis theory is also really amazing, but like most contemporary Marxist economists don't actually talk about overproduction anymore. Like they come up with other ways to explain crises that are like derived from other economic theories. And that's led to lots of controversy. So I'm just really excited about that example because I feel like it's really relevant to that debate.
Yeah, I think this is really has a lot of potential. I think we should definitely like use this is one of the main applications I would say of MES for that interests me is to try to treat like capital as individual capitals as co-regulators and then labor as a kind of invisible co-regulator that the interaction like the reason you have this and it keeps happening is labor is not really counted as a co-regulator, something like that.
It's also just worth mentioning, like, so another feature of some of the debates in crisis theory, like I think in some of your explanation, there's like a little bit of an ambiguity between what is the difference between overproduction and underconsumption. Because like underconsumption is also a really popular explanation, and that's sort of like, okay, it's more than like people can afford. It's like, and it's sort of the Keynesian idea of like effective demand, but like for instance, like in critique of crisis theory, the idea is that it's not necessarily a matter of the demand, but it's about like actually, overproduction with respect to the expansion of the market itself, right? So it's actually, it's like the structure of the market, not just the individual people who are like trying to consume or whatever, but like the entire structure of the market is sort of like out of balance with itself. Like production in the market like are not like just there's some kind of fracture happening. And it's not just relative to consumption, but like to the entire level of like the expansion of the money supply, of like economic accumulation, like capital accumulation. So there's lots of other directions to take this.
Yeah, one thing that I think also I don't think it's for nothing that Karatani kind of keeps the overproduction kind of point of view, because I think the better you can navigate between what he calls these different modes of exchange, the easier it is to combine these things. So for example, does it mean that the Keynesian point of view, which is very kind of state-centered in a certain sense, is wrong? No, but you can actually combine it. I mean, like you take guys like Robert Kurtz with their very hardcore crisis theory. All these things you can kind of start combining them together, because for example, you can have a going in line of what Dennis was saying, you can have something like you plan ahead for the how does it call it, the mortal the kind of leap, the kind of leap from production to consumption to take place, so you can kind of realize surplus. Well, this is not met, so you overproduce. This cannot become realized surplus value. Well, but the moment that this gets systemic, and it doesn't need to be like a one-off thing, it can be like a systemic problem. Well, the very form of the state will go in the direction of preventing this from happening, right? So, for example, you can have a co-regulator at the economic level that does not anticipate this, so it does overproduce. On the other hand, you can have, let's say, for example, what you have in welfare states, which is trying to lower the share of wages that go into anything other than buying commodities, right? So you pay for basic health system and so on and so forth, so that all the wages go back into buying production. Suddenly you have something which is a measure at the level of the state compensating for something which is at the level of capital, and you can actually distinguish things. So it remains true to talk about overproduction, but it also remains true that you can have like a systemic monetary / state-centered kind of thing. Like you could start trying to combine these things rather than flattening them and then comparing them, you know?
I understand what you're getting at. I mean, I think there's an interesting insight there. I do, at the same time, like I would generally endorse the argument that the sort of supposed like Keynesian state solutions to the crises like don't work.
No, it's not a matter of them working. Yeah, I don't even call it a solution. I think the issue is, should you take the consumption point of view to explain the crisis, not to solve it, or should you
Right.
take the production? I mean,
Right. You can look at it from both angles.
yeah,
It's
we
just-
should be able to, like, if you have like this weird complex composite of logics, you could actually account for why it looks in one way from some perspective. It looks slightly different. I mean, of course, if you think just solving effective demand by giving people random jobs, you know, will solve this problem. I mean, it doesn't. But I just have the impression that there is, like, I just wanted to go into this because it's something we didn't discuss when we wrote the primer as well. We stopped just before going into this, which is, I think that there are two types of, like, there is a definition of crisis, which has to do with something. It's a more dynamic definition of, you have some stability, then you go into something more unstable and so on. But there's also a more phenomenological definition of crisis, which is when you cannot get the information you need to continue to coordinate interactions. The two are connected, but they're not the same, right? I like this approach because, again, since we're always trying to connect the more epistemic with the more dynamic, with epistemic with the interactive and the compositional, the kind of the composite concept of crisis in this sense is very interesting, because that suddenly you lack information to act, goes along with the idea that some feedback is no longer, or there's some fracture in the sense you were saying that something anticipated does not follow through, right?
Mhm.
And that this is connected with how things are particularly composed. So there is a nice kind of approach to what we can mean by crisis in this sense, you know, to think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, we never really developed it, right?
Yeah, this is really cool part of the discussion too, because I feel like there's like a version of Marx that needs to be created that takes into that accepts the multiplicity principle. It's like in this whole, you know, discussion between different explanations for crisis and stuff, like crisis is a complex object, right? It's made up of, it can't be decomposed like to a simple set of causes. But we want to be able to say that on one hand, but also be able to say like Marx is still right, like the structural effects of capitalism are dominant in some sense. So yeah, I think there's a version of this that we can take this flexible framework and account for the other explanations even better than they can. I think that's the goal. But also, something you said here, Ro, was reminding me of, before this meeting, I was talking to John, and we were thinking about the role that other co-regulators play in kind of making fractures systemic and not overwhelming. So the way that police brutality or over-policing works in the United States, I think it can be formulated in terms of a fracture in the way that the police view themselves and their role in society. That could explain how police brutality continues to happen on the one hand, and also how this other co-regulators like politicians, judges, or like the legal system and like the media, they kind of work together to resolve the fracture in a sense. I don't know, John, if you wanted to talk about that a bit. I thought it was a nice example of like some fractures don't need to be totally resolved for the whole system to continue running. They can very well be kind of absorbed by other co-regulators.
Sorry, I just came back from the bathroom.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could fill me in on what you were just asking me.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was just asking, like, or I was just talking about the conversation we had where we were saying that the police have a fracture, and the system of like the media and legal system and politicians, they kind of heal that fracture over time, or make sure that that fracture is not enough to like crumble the whole system by creating, you know, like campaigns to you know, make people believe that the police are not over policing, or you know, creating legal protections for the police so that they don't have to change their
But
policies.
sorry, can you explain just a bit better? Why would this mean? I mean, why is the anticipated landscape and the actual landscape not matching up in this case? Like,
I just mean on a very basic level, like a cop is, you know, beating on someone or whatever, like using using too much violence in a given situation. That is a fracture in the sense that it's not anticipated the effects of like the blowback of, right, the community will react to that.
yeah, I would actually claim the opposite. I mean, just justifies continuing to use it. Like, you see, like we see that in Brazil, that's how people think. Like, we did the right thing. They got violent with us. We should continue being violent. Like, sounds.
So I actually,
No, but I think sorry.
Go ahead. Or okay, I mean, I wanted to say, like, this is actually a point where I think you can really connect it to trauma, and to some extent, like the death drive. Like, I don't know, like, so there are some people in the police force that like from my family, like they know, and like I've heard about their stories and stuff, like where, you know, from the perspective of those sorts of cops, they get into this state of mind where it's like just this sort of constant paranoia and this constant state of like constantly having to overcompensate for the worst possible case. Like they're sort of trained to think this way, and they live their entire lives this way to some extent. So like you have this sort of anticipated landscape of like, you know, all of the worst possible things that they could be imagining. They're like seeing the worst in people, and especially like certain kinds of people, like with racism, right, in the police force. So I feel like what you have is you have this anticipated landscape of like just this really like dangerous world. They're looking for the danger and like in specific places, when like the actual landscape is like not at all how they've come to present it to themselves, but like sort of what Gabriel was saying, like it ends up feeding back and like reinforcing their like false sort of fractured anticipated landscape, when it just ends up their own, you know, sort of fracture ends up creating more danger for them. And the more danger they see, the more they use it to justify their own existing landscape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me. Like, it looks like an organ that becomes autonomous. Like, I mean, because the real crazy thing you presented is how, which I think it's really important, which is we tend to think that the way an organism regulates itself should imply harmony between its parts. And what this theory is saying, that no, co-regulators, like the parts of your body are perspectives on your environment and your insights that don't necessarily match up. They need to be negotiated. Like, this is not a given. So if you move this to social systems, that means that part of the social system, they might see their own world quite different ways, even if they need to be mediated together, right? So if the fracture is like is the conflict between moments of a co-regulator, right? There is also the conflict between the co-regulators, which you were talking about before. And that seems to me more like the problem, that the more the police acts, the more it's confirmed that it should use violence. So it runs amok because it works so well, not because it works poorly. Like,
yeah, that's John, you can go ahead, but I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, for a little context in the conversation, was we were kind of trying to map the difference between how, from kind of like a higher order abstraction down, you would use limits, as opposed to kind of going from pieces up, you use co-limits. And part of that idea that we were trying to explore is like, when you're coming from the bottom up, you're piecing together a lot of things that are already composed and already have like a lot of the logics at play. Whereas when we've looked at the pairings in the past, we kind of looked at them as ways to simplify epistemically all the complexity. And so it's not so much that the police do or do not update. The fact is that the police are built to factor out a certain kind of thing which doesn't update. And it doesn't update. Like as a pure function, it simply isn't there updating the map. However much there's a confirmation of a certain kind of thing, the fact that there's a confirmation doesn't contradict that there's also a fracture, right? Like the confirmation is in many ways their side of the fracture. And I think a fracture, like a good example of a fracture is what happens like with neural net systems when they're playing Go, and they think they're winning and they're actually like not winning. It happens very rarely, but in the first big AlphaGo game, the guy that it played against managed to do it in one of the rounds. And I think that that's something similar to what police do. They have a criterion by which they're determining that they're doing what they think they're supposed to be doing, which they can then confirm by saying, yes, we should be more violent based upon that. But that very structure of the criterion is filtering out a certain kind of information that's also driving an actual fracture. And then the idea would be that as the fracture kind of percolates up, because there are other co-regulators that essentially are in symbiosis with this level that is, like, it's essentially symbiotic with the dysfunction of the update. It's symbiotic. The fact that the police aren't updating is a function for the overall capitalist system. But as we see in moments of like certain kinds of murders, certain kinds of violence, I mean, this is why it's so important for the US police to have such an extensive non-lethal weaponry arsenal, is because killing people is so much more likely to bubble the fracture up to higher levels. That doesn't mean that at like localized levels aren't fractures happening. It's the interesting problem, the sophistication, the like really effectiveness of capitalism is it kind of capture and contain them at certain levels. I think that was the general idea we were pushing there.
But wouldn't you want to have different names for this? Like, if just to keep the technical term, if fracture is the non-conciliated discrepancy between the anticipated landscape. Landscape is not the environment, is the built-in little scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there should be another name for, let's say, suicidal, destructive tendencies of a system that with its own inner model is doing fine, but it's just setting everything on fire, right?
I have a suggestion about this. I was just sort of thinking about it. It seems like part of the reason why it ends up with this sort of death drive, like self-destructive, suicidal thing, is that it's totally caught within a particular kind of like logical structure. Like I'm thinking specifically about sort of mode B and like maybe like sort of a classical logic of like, the state and like enemies of the state, or like criminals, like crime and like law and punishment, like these sorts of ways of thinking are what like sort of, transcendentally order like the entire like space of what the anticipated landscape can be for these people, right? But like I feel like if you're caught within a given sort of like logical space, like you could also potentially use that to like analyze like, could there be like actually like fractures between the transcendental like structures that like Karatani identifies? Like, is that relevant to thinking about like capitalist crisis and like police brutality, or even like issues with like nationalism, right? Like I don't know. I mean, this is sort of me just riffing on this, but I feel like there might be something.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like the idea that, for example, you can have a structure inside, like you can have these complex objects, which are all these modes together. But for example, the police organizes most of the relations by abstracting away from personal ties and supposedly from economic relations, right? It's like meant to be a very bureaucratic structure, exactly as you said, like dividing things into very classical kind of categories. You could imagine that this could lose traction with an environment that is composed in a way that you can't really slice so perfectly that way, right? So for example, in Brazil, we get this a lot because policemen are so poorly paid that having like communal ties with each other and making corrupt transactions are necessary for them to stay alive. So you can't anymore understand the logic of the police by looking at mode B, because the policemen are constantly organized by other criteria, but they are evaluated by the state as if the only thing that counts is mode B. Like when you were talking, I was recalling, you know, like, I'm not sure if you guys saw the best TV series of all time, The Wire, but in The Wire, the cops were always following this homicide spreadsheet. The only thing that mattered was clearing names in open homicides. Like whatever else is happening doesn't matter. It's abstracted away. That's all that actually counts, because that's what they need to send up on the command chain, and that's what regulates how much money they get. So that's pretty much kind of a practical abstraction in the sense you were talking about, like getting slowly detached. Like that landscape is true. It is a slice of the environment, but the complexity of the environment is such that that slice no longer has the same complexity as the environment, right? It's like it's just reducing it to one of the patterns, something like that. Not sure if that makes sense to you, right? Doesn't it make sense?
Yeah, that's a great example. The juking the stats thing in The Wire is like a classic example of a fracture that gets absorbed into higher levels. And the thing is, it works fine. Like, I think we should separate between fractures and dysfunction. They're the kind of two. Dysfunction is more of like kind of a subjective thing, because you can say like the prison system in the United States is, or the judicial system in the United States is functioning exactly as it should, because it is getting people paid in the end, right? That's like one way you could look at it, is that it is functioning fine. Or the way the police work, it's separate from whether there's a fracture. To decide if there's a fracture, we need the perspective, like the objective condition, objective analysis of like, are they out of touch with reality, which is I think different, like a slightly different thing. And there's I think one thing you were talking about, Gabriel, just now made me think that the peripheralization thesis, sorry, I cannot say
we
that
need
word.
a better name for that.
Yeah, that's basically like that's the story of how capitalism functions fine with fractures. Like the more fractures you have, almost like the better, right? So like when you're talking about how the police function in Brazil, that is
Okay, but let me just ask, so perhaps I didn't understand the concept, man, just so I can make sure I understand. Like I thought fracture just meant that, like, from previous experience, the regulator has some model of what will happen when it acts, and then what happens is not what it was expecting, right? So, like, for me, that has something different than, for example, the idea, which I think it's the basis of the peripherization thesis, is a thesis that says that the idea that communal, state, and productive institutions, that they formed a homogeneous kind of block, like they were structured in some composite way, that everything has those three things. That would be, let's say, the goal of the golden years of capitalist institutions. They would tie together all these three things and kind of reproduce a certain common normative set of tools that would expand throughout society, right? And the peripherization thesis is saying, no, that's actually an exception. Capitalist in general has conflicting normative commitments. So, for example, your commitments when you deal with the police and how you need to behave, how you behave at the school, how you behave at work, how you behave with your family, and how all those things act in different places in a city, right? None of that needs to homogenize. You can have very heterogeneous kind of shards of social space, and because that doesn't get in the way of capital. Capital can circulate without creating a homogeneous space for humans. Like, from the standpoint of those institutions, they can still be functioning well. Like popular churches in Brazil, they have a picture of the world and they assess who comes in, if they should stay, if they shouldn't, and they kind of function. Police, with their own crazy corrupt militia schema, they also kind of function. It's actually ridiculously stable, you know, all these things, but they don't really add up. And if you want to rule over them, you need to constantly move between these normative things. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound to me like what you named by fracture, because it just sounds like a weird heterogeneous interplay between these different regulators, and not, let's say, a constant frustration with trying to anticipate what will happen and it doesn't, right?
Yeah. I think to clarify, like the heterogeneity is distinct from the fracture. The heterogeneity doesn't necessarily mean fracture, but I guess the tendency for fractures to appear might increase, because if the social landscape is broken, is fragmented, that means how can any individual co-regulator ever create an accurate landscape? Like it's almost like it's creating the conditions for fractures, because one co-regulator cannot possibly traverse, it doesn't have the same grammar, it doesn't have the same language to like cover the social landscape. So it's, and maybe the police in a particular neighborhood may never have any fractures because whatever reason, it's a rich neighborhood or whatever. But then you put those same police in a different neighborhood and fractures appear, and like, you know, they're totally not understanding like why are the techniques that worked in this area not working here? Maybe we need more money, let's just like throw money at it. The problem, you know, like but the tendency for the fractures increases, and that could be part of the perforization thesis, right? Like
yeah, because I mean, this also goes back to the crisis debate. I think that there are two types of crisis theory, right? There's a crisis as something that interrupts some process, but there's crisis as a way of operating, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can have types of capital that thrive during social crisis. They're working fine, right? So
have you all read that book, Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb? Like,
never.
I really like
call?
him. I'll type it in the chat. So he's like really interesting. He's definitely like the most Marxist Wall Street trader, in my opinion. Very interesting thinker, like in many ways, like, you know, Anwar Sheikh is like a Marxist economist who sort of cites him approvingly in some respects. He came up with the sort of the black swan idea.
Okay, he's the black swan guy.
Yeah, and that was part of his. I think Antifragile is a much better book than Black Swan, which I haven't finished Black Swan. But what's really interesting about this idea, it's like he talks about antifragile systems as like, he compares it to the Hydra, like it's like sort of, please cut off my head, like it actually thrives off of disorder. And like he's sort of saying that we should strive to be antifragile. Like this is a guy who made money off of the Great Recession, and he's like, be like me, you know. So it's really, really fascinating, like really symptomatic, but also like really brilliant, legitimately. But I was also sort of just going to challenge a little bit of this view, like the limits of this view, because like I think like sort of from the like the Tsuchida perspective, and like you can sort of really get this from reading the essay whenever I can get a chance to scan it. Like there's this aspect of it where no matter how well the system, it sort of like actually reminds me of what John was saying about the neural nets playing Go. Like they think they're winning, and like you know, they're not actually winning. Like I feel like this is basically how like the sort of capital nation state, more man not, like it gets to this place where it's like it's anti-fragility, it gets high off of this, and like it thinks that it's winning. But meanwhile, like the fundamental like processes required for the sustainability of living systems themselves are like completely being undermined. Like it's digging its own grave while it's sort of thinking like, oh my gosh, like I'm doing so well. So like the fracture like maybe is only detectable from a particular place in the analysis. Like we can predict like, oh wow, like this is opening up a space where at least our anticipated landscape based on this knowledge we have about Earth systems, say, is going to create more fractures in the future. Like ultimately the capitalism, like it works from its own perspective within limits that it ultimately can't overcome.
But I think that's a really good point, but just that's where I think like keeping the distance between environment and like some word for a system that it gets kind of decoupled or blind to its environment, and environment versus landscape, which is to say this internal thing. I think that this difference between the two is very good. It's very important to keep because for example, this is how we get to bring complexity back into the picture, because it would take a much more complex system in a qualitative sense, right, with different kind of basic components, to be sensitive to this information from the environment that is saying you think you're thriving, but you're actually going down the hill, right? Because otherwise we can get into that sort of view that I think we're trying to avoid, which is that knowledge in the abstract sense of I know about the effects on the earth of crazy capitalist systems. True, but there is no complex system in place, complex enough to be sensitive to those global effects, right? So we want to be able to distinguish between, let's say, actual information that actually makes a difference and the theoretical representation of that information, which, I mean, we do have access to that theory, but it's kind of just in our minds. It's not really like something that reaches us as an information about that part of the environment, right? So I think that's relevant because I think it helps to explain, especially, for example, in the left ecosystem, because you get more and more socially fragmented societies. When you're a small organization, the part of the environment that you actually relate to, forming your landscape, it's a partial one. So when you generalize out of your landscape to the world you're in, it looks like you're much better than you actually are, or it looks like the world has some features that it doesn't, right? I think the same applies to what you're saying, like, because some procedure is working for these crazy speculative financial people, but it's only a fragment of the world. It's just like an abstraction from an environment onto a landscape, which is being confirmed.
This makes me think of how Karatani uses the term transcendental illusion a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think it has something to do with that.
Like how he defines mode D to some extent. Like, I guess in a way I've been thinking about mode D kind of in terms of like, you know, what is the transcendental illusion that also sort of creates a certain structure for, I guess, movements that are sort of resisting the totalization of society by the CNS knot. And it has this sort of weird, a different kind of explicit relation between actuality and virtuality. Like, I think that the, you know, sort of CNS, like it has a sort of, I guess, I don't know which kind of negation I want to use here, like a kind of maybe repressed virtuality. Like, it doesn't acknowledge it's the virtual character of like its sort of transcendental illusion. Like, it thinks that it's actually winning. Whereas I think maybe one of the things about mode D that like would make it like better is that it actually is capable of acknowledging this, that it's actually capable of making this distinction and saying like, you know, this mode itself, it is like an anticipated landscape. Like, it is a transcendental illusion or like a virtuality that we're like engaging with here. And like that gives it a better sort of like more resources to actually, you know, manage its relationship to the environment, if that makes sense.
I think there's a big interesting discussion there, but just before we say anything else, I know John had his hand up and just totally ran over his turn. Sorry, John.
It's all good. It's gone a little far away. Maybe I'll come back later, but I'm gonna pass.
Yeah. I have just a few more slides, but yeah, on the mode D point, I think it is interesting. I think just to remain close to the technical definition also is like, we can only have an anticipated landscape if we have a corresponding procedure that'll get us there. So I do like this idea of transcendental illusion, but I think with the MES formalism, like, we have to specify what is the procedure. So like, there's no anticipated landscape without a proposed something in the action space you can choose that would lead to that. And yeah, so then that just opens up another question of what the mode D procedure is, right? That's the big question.
I think it goes back to the reason why we ended up, I mean, I don't think we're against Karatani's mode D. It's just like a prudency of saying that a regulative idea or some ethical point of view or something that we anticipate in theory cannot substitute all the procedures that go into exactly the theorem you were talking about, like the required complexity theorem. It's the bone in the throat of Karatani, because it would take some level of complexity so that it's not an ideal in my mind that the Earth exists, but that I actually get to interact with the Earth qua Earth. It takes like actual organizational structure so that you can actually interact with the planet in that level. Otherwise, you're kind of imagining you're doing so. There should be some distinction there, right?
Well, right, but I guess my point is that like we kind of have to imagine that we're doing it, right? That's part of the process. So I guess what I'm trying to say is really just that, like, for me, the difference is that, like, you know, capital nation state tries to pretend that it's not imagining it when it is imagining it. Whereas, like, if we're capable of acknowledging how we're imagining it in the process of both doing and imagining it like makes it actually easier to do both. That's my contention. This is going to be like a much, I'm sure going to have opportunities to talk about this in more depth away from the MES stuff too. But like, that's how I see it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, I'm gonna go through the last, how many slides? I have 4 slides left. So dysynchrony, I pretty much covered this already. This is, the diagram is from the book, but the idea of a fracture that takes, so yeah, what happens when you have a fracture is other co-regulators potentially have procedures to ameliorate that fracture. And depending on the different outcomes of that process, you have different types of pathologies or recoveries of the system as a whole, right? Because ultimately these co-regulators are trying to keep the system alive in some sense. That's kind of their goal, but they do it in different ways. They have different landscapes. So this these 3 lines in the thing, they're different variables. So that, because it's all about temporality, I believe the pi is the time lag of the minimum time lag of the co-regulator. So that's the minimum amount of time it takes to complete all 3 phases: decoding, regulation, encoding. If you add that up, you get pi. D is the period. So what is the average duration of a step and of a co-regulator? And Z is the I think it's the stability span of the components required to complete a step, right? So you have this idea of like you have some resources and you need those resources to actually exist, to reproduce yourself as a co-regulator. Those resources are not finite, or they're not infinite. They have a stability span, which means that they become unstable eventually and they disappear. Kind of like, our environment as humans, right? It's not an infinite resource. So it has a stability span. So what happens is if the pi variable goes up, meaning latency, we get slower because we have so much complexity to deal with. We can't decode and regulate and encode in the same speed as before. We're doing things slower. And at the same time, the stability of your environment is decreasing. Then you get this bottom right diagram, which is death, right? Because you're basically you're squeezed from both sides, right? You're getting slower, and also the world is crumbling. So you can't escape that once you get into that cycle. So, but then there's these other possibilities where you have some pathology. It's like it is squeezing, but then through some complexification of some type, you're able to restore the temporal constraints again. So basically all of these are different possibilities that you can describe using just these 3 variables. I think there's a lot of potential here to describe things. I'm not sure if it's directly applicable to STP stuff, but yeah, I mean, we rarely talk about how there's like limited time to do things. But
This kind of reminds me a little bit of like, I don't know if this is really addressed in the MES text, but it kind of reminds me of like Malibu's like plasticity stuff, especially the second paragraph, like productive dyschrony and also like destructive dyschrony. I just sort of got that flash of like the way Malibu contrasts like constructive plasticity and like destructive plasticity. I don't know, maybe there's like more of a gap there than I'm sort of like imagining here, but it just reminded me of that distinction.
Yes, exactly. There's this distinction between systems that under this kind of temporal pressure, they evolve into a more complex system that's capable of managing things better. And then there's the systems that under the temporal pressure, they die. And it's like, there's no, just like the binding problem and the integration problem, there's no general solution to how to like fix dysynchrony. It's just a part of it is just another measure of the complexity of the system that, you know, creating the next co-limit or whatever finding the binding problem or the binding agent of a problem. That's how you get out of this loop of dysynchrony. But yeah, definitely plasticity has a lot to do with it. Yeah, like if in the case of the brain, if you injure one part of the brain, like another part of the brain can actually compensate, right? So it's possible that you don't lose that much brain functioning overall, and that would be an example of like a temporary pathology that is restored more or less. So I try to take this idea and like apply it to fake news. So you have these this kind of example here of you have the climate, it's changing, you have the state, and I'm including within the state like scientific community gets some evidence of that happening, and some of that evidence also gets on social media, so people generally have an idea of like what's going on in the world in terms of the climate, but then you just need enough encoding of misinformation in the mix there that you produce this cycle of the citizens decoding conspiracy theories along with real information, right? They're like mixed together. Then you encode that back into social media in terms of disseminating fake news or misinformation. And then this creates a fracture, right? The landscape of the citizenry it deviates just enough from the actual system that you can slow down, if not destroy, like certain collective procedures. Like, you know, just create enough, like in the case of Chile with the Constitution, be an example, like from what I hear, there's a lot of misinformation going around that blocks the voting of the Constitution, and you just need enough to like delay the process, right? It doesn't have to like make everyone paranoid and like accept the conspiracy, but you just need enough to like delay things. And I think that's an example of this temporal desynchronization, right? Like a fully synchronous system, I would say, would be one where you get evidence of climate change and then you act on it and then it's resolved, right? But we see today, it's like the time it takes to act, it seems to be the time it takes to act is shrinking, which is the drop in the Z variable. And the D variable is also like stuck because we're not going any faster because of the misinformation. And then the pi is going up, meaning that the lag, the latency of operating across different communities seems to be increasing as well. Like there's no like one organization that can coordinate all the different states together. So this is an example of how fractures bubble into larger co-regulators. Does this slide make sense?
I feel like it's a little bit like I get the basic idea. I don't know if they're like, I'm trying to think about what aspects of it I might be having trouble parsing. It might just be because I'm trying to read the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I just sent like 200 huge messages to John.
Oh, holy shit! Yeah, this is.
Yeah, can we just, like, before we go to the slide, because I think it relates directly to what's in the slide page, can we just see if these words can be distinguished? Like, okay, using our Badiou language and then moving into the MS system language. Like, there is like multiplicity, which is like just extensional stuff. Then you have worlds, which they have no subjects. They're not worlds from a particular perspective. Then there are worlds to particular sensors, which then are the environments, right? Like the Umwelt is a world, but it's already a world to a bug, a world to a human, a world. So it's the environment in the sense of the differences in the world relevant to some being, right? Mm-hmm. Landscapes are a reduction of environments, because environments are relative to sensors or to objects, to the internal composition of the object itself. So it's like what information that particular object or animal or institution stores of its environment. So we can both share landscapes in the sense that they are very similar. We can share environments in the sense that objective differences that make a difference are the same to us. And we can share worlds, which are asubjective relational spaces, right? And we can also not share landscapes, in the sense that the information I stored from the same environment is different from you, even though the differences that make a difference are the same. We cannot share environments because the way that we relate to the world is different. So a police institution will have an environment that is different from, let's say, money, has a different environment. And we can also not share worlds, because what we claim to exist out there, regardless of relations to us, is actually different. For example, the capitalist world doesn't realize that the planet exists, right? So that would be like a clash of worlds, not a clash of environments and not a clash of landscapes. So does that distinction make sense, John? Like, that's where I was getting at.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just don't know if that's like, is that correct, Dennis? Like, I'm not the one that.
Yeah, it makes sense, but I just don't think it's true.
Like, it makes sense. I just don't know. Like, my sense of what I saw is environment is not so subjectivated, I guess. Like, an environment isn't necessarily the multiple, but it's also like, I think it's closer to a world, and they're like seem to be more kind of mutually a thing. But again, I've been just going off of the presentation, so it makes sense. You might have the right interpretation, in which case a number of things are just said with shit, but that's not. So I'll turn it over to Dennis.
Yeah, Dennis, you decide.
I don't know, but well, to me, I just think of the landscape as being the environment and the subjective like apprehension, because landscape, like, we have to make sure that it applies to like non-conscious stuff also, right? Even like really simple systems, or like systems that don't have consciousness, have landscapes.
Yeah, but the good regulator theorem implies like a key has a landscape of the lock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but that's
not environment.
That's in the key. The key is the landscape, the shape of the key.
Yeah.
So again, like, the landscape is an arrow from the object to itself, preserving information about the exterior, right?
But that's why, if we have a different, I mean, I'm confused now, because that would make environment shared, right? If it's the landscape, that's the reference to itself.
No, look, I think if I just do this, I think it becomes clear. Like you can have something like a world, because I don't need to add a point of view to the final world, right? Then I add a point of view of this little being. Then you can say, okay, from this world to this being, like this particular, some relations are relevant to this being, but some are not. Like some changes in light or some cosmic shifts in whatever that don't matter, right? They might affect things, but only these things matter. And then inside this being, there is some stored information about the differences that make a difference to it. So you could
Okay, maybe like it might help me kind of reframe the question, because originally it was coming out of this idea of the police updating a landscape. So what's the kind of political stakes in distinguishing these things more so than, I guess that's, yeah, that's my question.
Like, for example, a landscape, I would, in the police case, right? You have the social world. Well, the social world includes gift economy, state elements, commercial elements, and a lot of other stuff, which is not A, B, or C. It's not like a general like coordinating principle of social life. The police institution is structured in a certain way, as we were talking about. For example, it's very, very much arm of the state, not so much a direct arm of private companies. So it has some composition. So the things that matter to it in this very complex social world are reduced. It's not everything that matters. The policeman is not asking like, are we friends? I mean, idealize police in the vacuum, right? Are we friends, or is this profitable? It's not really the first questions the policeman is asking. He's asking, is this in the law or is this a crime? So it's already reducing the social world to a slice of it, where mode B is really the main one. So that's its environment. Differences that make a difference are property law, crime, things like this. Then there is, for that particular institution, the information about that social reality that it keeps with itself and that it uses to decide what to do given new social phenomena. That would be the landscape. So all the procedures internal to the organization, when something happens, you should act like this. When people say this to you, usually because of this or that, right? That would be the landscape. The actual social relations of property and legal relations, that would be its environment. And the social world, which includes much more than that, would be the world. But the world is not defined by how it appears to the police. That's why the police doesn't see everything. So yeah, that's how I would distinguish the three things.
I kind of see that, but I think that there's some, I would disagree on a few things. Like, first off, I think like, even at the level of the police kind of like constructing, like, all right, so there's their information gathering capacity, which we're saying is roughly the landscape, and then like kind of the register of the world that they are attuned to or that they're dealing with is more the environment. But I think that that's like the operations of police regularly quite deftly dance through all of the modes, right?
Yeah,
like,
but I said police in the vacuum. Like, if we now add reality to it, right? Real pressure and temperature.
But that's the real environment of it, right? That's the actual environment.
Yeah, but the actual environment is still a reduction. Like, even if it's complex and it has mode A, mode B, and mode C, it's still a reduction from the world.
Sure, it's a reduction from the world, but I think that, like, I think part of the cut from an environment to a landscape, and part of why, like, I do, like, I don't see the point of a distinction, and I kind of see why it might be useful to kind of keep it in one concept, is like, I think that the formal cutting off of things is more in the step between what you're calling an environment to a landscape. Like, I think the police, their environment, they're very capable of sensing all kinds of things that aren't limited to mode B. I think that how they process that information and how they kind of like reflexively mediate it bureaucratically, that's where mode B comes in, but that's closer to the landscape. And it's at that level that I think the short circuits that kind of enable these moments kind of come out.
Yeah, but I think that the thing that is making us make then, from what you said, the place where the confusion is, or the disagreement is coming in, is that what you mean by police are people. What I mean by police is not people, right? I mean, of course, people in the world are seeing much more than their function as policemen, right? But as policemen, so from the objective phenomenological point of view, right? From the institution of the police, there is some environment that is meaningful, which is not the whole world. Like if you talk about policemen like as people, then you're right. Like the environment of those people they're part of the social world. So it looks like the reduction happens after, like internally, when they go to the police station and talk about what they're gonna do, right? But that's, let's say, starting from very, very complex individuals, which are part of social reality, then seeing them go into the police station. Yeah, it's true. Then it looks like world, and then inside the police station, landscape, right? But
I just wanted to mention that I think I'm with Gabriel on this partially because like the way he is using the word environment, it immediately brings to mind like the way that word is used in the context of like Stafford Beer's like viable system model, second order cybernetics, like the idea of environment as like what isn't incorporated into the memory. Like it's part of the system, it's part of the viable system, it's not part of the world. But like the key difference seems to be the way that like the concept of memory, like this is also what makes MES different from cybernetics. Like the concept of memory, like this is at least how I'm sort of getting the idea of a landscape is like something that actually has to be integrated into the memory, right? Like it has to participate in that, and it's different from just like one of the inputs into the system, but it's how the system is represented by a part of the system to the rest of the system, right?
yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like a world would include all the things that are not inputs to the system. An environment would include all the things that are inputs to the system, right? And the landscape would include where, once the input arrives, how is this kind of latched on and structured inside the system, right?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So there's pre-decoding, we'll use the terminology. There's pre-decoding, which is the environment, and then after you decoded and you're building the landscape, you're taking the raw signals from the environment and you're constructing something else that's distinct from the environment.
Yeah, for example, policemen are constantly seeing that they are hated, like, but they're not featuring this in their landscape in terms of, yeah, something is really wrong because people hate us. They're like, the liberal leftist media is like infusing hate in people. Like that's how they're connecting the dots in their own kind of inner ideology kind of thing, right? So you can distinguish the inputs they're getting from the landscape they're constructing that's going to direct how they proceed. And there's also the inputs they're not getting, right? But they exist. So how do we call the space of stuff that is not inputs to the police but still exists?
Yeah, I think we can find, to go back to John's thing of like the political stakes, is we can resolve the police brutality issue but in different ways. One is by enhancing the receptors. So by creating more ways of sensing, to create more signals that the police have to take in. For example, creating laws that fine the police more, to reallocate money in certain ways, right? Like that. But okay, that goes against the idea that there's, in a vacuum, they don't sense money. But let's just say like different laws can be put in place that will modify the signals, and that would correspond to altering the receptors. But then there's also changing the way that they decode the existing set of inputs, which may involve some like internal changes in the procedures, or how they relate to those signals. I feel like that's something like that. I mean, sounds abstract now, but it's like two different strategies for modifying a co-regulator.
Yeah, I mean, I totally see what John meant also, because I mean, of course, there is no police to which money doesn't matter, right? Or property doesn't matter in terms of its connection to money. Like, clearly, one thing that reinforces that using violence is not a problem is that, well, it's always used against some people rather than others. And the people that actually pay the police in terms of, like, guaranteeing funding and things like this, which are politicians, they are fine with it. So you get to reinforce that that's a good procedure. So clearly that there is a connection with all this complexity, even though, I mean, this is something we haven't gotten that far, but we should be able to also distinguish between, and perhaps this distinction between world, environment, and landscape is helpful in that direction, that it's not enough to add complex, like transcendental layers to get a full picture of the world. So you can have social objects that are composed by these 3 layers, as every object ultimately is, but you still get a partial view, right? You still have a partial environment. So even though, like, policemen are definitely attuned to all these things, like, they don't give a shit that dominated communities are frightened and hate the police. So they are in connection to these communal ties. They also have, like, clear, constant kind of interactions with economic structures that they need to preserve. Some of them, the others they don't care for. In Brazil, for example, a lot of people don't show their identity cards when they meet the police. They show their working cards, because if you're a regulated worker, the police is less likely to harass you than if you are if you don't have, like, a formal employment kind of proof. So there you go, like, clear censor to economic things, right? Plus the whole legal and layer, which is the most obvious one. So I totally agree when John says this, but the weird thing is that this doesn't guarantee, like, these layers are not enough to guarantee that you get a picture of the world that is conductive, or that is shared, coextensive with those of civil society, for example, right? So we still need some other things, some other ways of tweaking these descriptions of composition that allows us to account for why the pictures of the world are so different from these perspectives, even though they're all complex, right? But I'm not sure, John, did this make more sense, like this way of approaching it, or does it not?
Yeah, I think one thing that is coming up the more I just stare at this picture in front of me is, I think, and it's similar to when we want to use things like categories too, is like, with a police department, and even, that also might be different, is the emphasis on what kind of, where the analysis locks in, but essentially, like, where do you localize what is a co-regulator, right? Is it a policeman? Is it a police department? Like, what, because when we ask that, like, we've got all these, like, the co-regulator has the memory outside of itself. It's got the effectors, the receptors outside of itself. But as you kind of, like, scale up in a department, those things I would imagine, somehow be represented inside of a larger, higher order co-regulator. So maybe part of the issue is what is environment at a lower level ends up becoming landscape as you kind of scale up. And
Yeah, I think that's really good
abstraction. And that's, I think, might be one way to kind of parse out this difference a bit.
That's really cool.
I like that idea. Yeah, one more thing on that is just, yeah, body cams or receptors, the count of the murder count or whatever would be the decoding step. Like the way that you were just mentioning the example from The Wire, like how you parse the signal and how you record it on a list and how you categorize different crimes. That's part of the decoding step. And then encoding would be like what weapons can a police carry, or like, what are the different things that a police can do at the individual level only. I'm just trying to use an example here, but I think that's a way I'm thinking of dividing these things.
Yeah, I'm also trying to find here, there's a moment in the book where they say something that goes, I mean, I really like this way of talking, John, I think it's really, really good because, yeah, you're definitely right. Like, there is something about, say, the landscape that is relevant to a policeman, but the way that these patterns are stored in the police is actually through procedures or manuals or things that, like, what is outside of a policeman is actually inside the police station, right? Something like this. So as we move in complexity, things that look like the environment for a person can become part of what's the internal landscape for an institution, right? For example,
yeah, and then you could look at like auditing and internal affairs. Like there's all this built on reflexive infrastructure that kind of complicates where you draw, I think, this line between landscape and environment.
like, I think you can even do this nicely in terms of like Tayloristic methods of kind of producing patterns for work out of, you know, more complex interactions between people and actual labor practices. So for a certain worker, they're kind of dealing with the material as something that's outside of them, right? They don't know exactly, but they're doing it and they're kind of refining some trade. Then you can get like a higher view where that relation is now itself kind of codified inside the workplace as the right way of dealing with that material. Like now that's part of the landscape of production.
So
But
I have.
sorry,
just, oh, did I?
No, please go. I'm just trying to find a quote here.
Right. So I was sort of just thinking about like, you know, is it possible to like have a kind of co-regulator that instead of sort of being like internal to like the decoded landscape would actually function like between a landscape and an environment, or like between like other layers? Like we're thinking about co-regulators as like internal to like the MES, as like already assuming that the like the environment has been decoded into a landscape. But like the fact that we can still talk about environments and worlds and multiplicity, whatever else is like beyond the landscape, kind of implies to me that there's a way to like have like some kind of co-regulation that's like actually outside of just being the internality of the MES. Does that make sense?
You're talking about like a co-regulator that's interacting with an MES from outside of the MES. Something like that.
Something like that. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, isn't that what like a scientific experiment, something like this, right?
yeah.
You create, I mean, you create a different system. What will count as an input and output for it will be different than what counts for you, and you need to take very good care that, you know, your own biases in your own landscape of the world is not guiding how you build the experiment. So probably I mean, that's a really good way of distinguishing experience from experimentation, right?
Yeah, and I was actually just thinking like maybe like a co-regulator like between a landscape and an environment is kind of how I'm thinking of like mode D. Like if you're thinking about like experimental politics, like it's not just experiencing it from within your own landscape, but like actually like having some kind of protocol to like bring the environment and the landscape like into interaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, here it's like I'm almost tempted to say it's like the individual is a co-regulator and then like an organization is another co-regulator.
Yeah.
And you have the individual landscape, and the co-regulator is mediating your individual landscape is the outcome of your interaction with this organization, and the organization is what interacts with the outer world. Something like that.
That's more how I would approach it. Like rather than assuming that you can sidestep this kind of internal, external thing, just imagine that like an individual can be part of a larger thing whose structure gets access to things in the world that you individually cannot, right? So, I mean, I don't think it's even necessarily a good thing to imagine that, well, we can sidestep this kind of partial blindness and get like a better access. I mean, this whole idea that we've been kind of in the background toying with, right? That, well, it takes some complexity to be able to interact with something of a similar complexity. It solves that problem by a different route, right? Well, if you want to interact with, you know, waves from the Big Bang, like gravitational waves from the Big Bang, you need experiments, that systems that have some type of form, right? That will get you to interact with those forms. You cannot interact with every form from everywhere or from every composition. So let's say, this is something we discussed a long time ago, and kind of was a hint we had on how would we talk about, for example, climate change from the perspective we've been developing. Like, it could be something like the difference between expecting a reduction of complexity from the world to smaller organizations, like countries, right? To the idea that probably you need a very specific type of international organization that is binding together in countries and producers from different places in the world in such a way that this organism, it actually concretely interacts with the planet, right?
Maybe like, I guess I'm also thinking in terms of like, this might be not a very MES thing, because I'm thinking of it kind of in like plasticity terms, but like, okay, so on the one hand, if you're talking about like Ashby's law, like requisite variety, complexity, that stuff, you can talk about it quantitatively, but I feel like you could also potentially talk about it in like a, you know, like qualitative, like how you're doing it, not just how much complexity. Like you can have a ton of complexity and completely be unable to deal with the environment. This is like why Stafford Beer distinguishes between like when it's just proliferating, which maybe be like destructive dyschrony, and like when it's actually regulating. Like, so for this, I'm thinking about maybe the dyschrony aspects. So I guess I'm also thinking like part of the process isn't just to increase complexity to reflect the environment, but it's also to like change the form of the complexity itself away from just sort of like, you know, some kind of destructive proliferation to one that's like actually a more constructive kind of complexity, more plastic, whatever. So I guess part of what I was thinking of, like, you know, why it's good to have that sort of regulative idea is because it has that sort of effect on like the qualitative or like the form of the complexity. If that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Like
Yeah.
I was trying to find a quote here as we were talking, to go back to John's point, because there is a moment in the text that they claim that there is a reason why there are like co-regulators are harder to find at lower levels. Like there is a moment where they're talking about, like, you could say that an atom is kind of the regulator of its particles, but that's kind of stretching it a bit, because I just wanted to find the quote. So they make a connection between, let's say, moving down towards the policeman's level, and why, let's say, you need to stretch it a bit to call it a co-regulator in the same sense that higher level structures of the police department, police structure, procedures, and so on would be, you know? Yeah, that's, what does this mean, John? I mean, it sounds, is this your picture for the police and the policeman?
It's just what came in my head when we started talking about, but I think it was Anna talking about, like, kind of looking back, all the things folding in on themselves. It's not more than just a visual.
So it looks cool though. I mean,
All right. Yeah. So I just wanted to finish the presentation.
sorry, I'm sorry.
But yeah, to Anna's last point also, I think the idea of a scientific community is interesting from the perspective of, I almost feel like the scientific community, if we were just to restrict everything to science or epistemology, scientific community is kind of like mode D in action there. If we were to talk about a mode D, because it kind of parses the world through like this rigorous framework that like is able to absorb a ton of complexity, but in a way that's like more or less productive. I mean, if you discount the fact that it's channels that into like weapons manufacturing eventually at some.
You can connect this directly to the isonomia concept, like in Isonomia and the Origins of Philosophy by Karatani, like how he connects that to like the way that science developed in Ionia, which was like structured through mode D, like, and all of those ways of thinking that like led to the development of science in the West, that like he specifically makes that connection explicit in his conceptualization of it. And like, I mean, it's interesting too, when you look at like how Anaximander, like there's this one physicist I'm really interested in, Carlo Rovelli, who like was like all obsessed with Anaximander. So like, I think I'm going to be drawing a little bit on like, you know, is there still that continuity of legacy that you could think of like mode D as like being based in the sort of relations that Karatani identifies in Ionia as representing mode D, to like how that actually has had continuity with like, is the scientific community like in a sense a model of mode D, and to what extent is it, and to what extent is it not?
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, I think it's not fully mode D in the sense that we care about and that Karatani ultimately cares about, but it's like a shrunk version, like a toy version of, I don't want to say toy, but it's a miniaturized version of mode D. And it also fulfills the roles that you were saying about a co-regulator that kind of it informs the landscapes that we can make.
Yeah, I found a quote here. I'm just putting it here. It's from their book.
Yeah, should I read this? See, the net of co-regulators does not form a strict hierarchy, where there can exist several of them of the same level, meaning that their agents are on this level, possibly with different timescales. For example, in a nation, the co-regulator representing a major city has a different timing from that of one representing a small village. There are generally no co-regulators at the lowest level, or they are degenerate. For instance, the nucleus of an atom can be considered as such a co-regulator at the particle level, its agents being the nucleons and protons constituting the nucleus.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that what I thought it did. I just focused on there are no co-regulators at the lowest level, but now that I see a bit, they're just saying that, well, I mean, it's kind of to the point, right? That there is degeneracy when you go down. So the policeman is not a co-regulator of the same type of process that the police station is, or the police department is necessarily, right?
Yeah, I think scale relativity is important. Yeah, here for what counts as a co-regulator.
But I mean, that would go to John's point that perhaps in this non-transitive move from the policeman to the police station, what looks for the policeman like a process that's outside of him, part of his environment, which includes other policemen, people, and so on. From the police station, it's divided in a totally different way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. Just wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's important. And it's relevant to this slide as well, which is the way memory works is also a relational model. It's not like one thing. Like memory can be different depending on what co-regulator is that you're talking about. And so it's all about how it relates to those objects in the category. How do I start here? So like if we look at the diagram on the left, you'll see that the red circle is like a object that has some signals that come in through the receptors. So the gray and the blue circles are the receptors. The arrows coming from the red circle to the receptors are the aspects. And like we covered in the first presentation, a perspective is just a set of aspects that are correlated. So I used the purple lines to show correlations between three of the receptors. Receptors are not necessarily like your organs, like your eyes and ears and stuff. They can be, but they can also be just aspects, things that can register aspects of a thing. So like you might have a receptor for the shape of something, the receptor for the color of something, the receptor for the movement of something, and that all can reside in your eye, or be various functions of the eye. So yeah, so you have these receptors and they're correlated somehow, and because they're correlated, you can bind the different aspects of a thing together. And this is stage one, right? Creating that perspective of a thing. But to have memory, you need a second step, which is to further parse the receptors into agents of your component. So it's like your component has its own call them like internal receptors, but they're just agents of the co-regulator. They also have information that they get from the receptors. And they construct a landscape from that.
I have a request. Could you like zoom in on the diagram a little bit more? Because it's just pretty small within the.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do I do that? If I go to here, I think I can do that.
Okay.
Is that better? Oh, maybe that's. So the blue circles are the agents of the co-regulator. They are actively facilitating getting information from the receptors for the co-regulator, and it's their work that allows the construction of the landscape. So I guess the point here is that a perspective of an object is not enough to turn it into a memory. You need some other set of things to like consolidate that perspective for the co-regulator. And that's what the landscape does. So
Sorry,
you have
just to see if I understood. So this is, let's say, some external thing.
Yeah.
And let's say it excites these three things.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it has some relation to all these, but these ones here, they have this inner structure, so that the connection of this with this and the connection of this with this, it confirms, like this link here between the two confirms the aspects from outside, right? So, for example, the fact that some light reaches one eye and reaches the other eye, the two eyes have some relation between them, that this and this makes sense with the two eyes, right? That's why these are kind of activated together here.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just, let's say, the first thing for why this information here in these sensors is being passed forward rather than the other gray dots, right?
Yeah,
Because
the other gray dots are not integrated together. So you're getting the signals, but you're unable to integrate it all into one perspective.
Yeah,
so you can do multiple perspectives here, but
like you can imagine, for example, that the purple arrows here have to do with the structure of a tissue, so that this part of the tissue is connected to this part of the tissue that is connected to this part. And the fact that this burns the tissue here, excites the tissue here in such a way that respects the inner structure of the tissue, that's, let's say, makes a consistent imprint, right? Something like that. Okay, so this is the first step. And then the idea is that, I'm just trying to understand the two green dots here. So the process in this direction is constructing the landscape through these agents.
Yeah.
Right. So this has something to do with storage of information based on this, right?
Not storage is a second step. There's another step where you can store it, but the construction of the landscape is just the like
a registering of some sort.
Registering in the co-regulator, yeah.
Yeah, we want to move from, let's say, excitement here to something more like information here. I don't know. Because it just seemed, if I understood correctly, then let's say the record of the perception or something like this and the record of the information, they're the two that need to be correlated afterwards, right? This co-limit here is the co-limit of these two things here, right? Is that correct?
You mean the two green dots are I think the two green dots are here. I think the green dot on the right would be a cone. It's a co-limit for the information coming from the blue, but it has it can be less than the perspective.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some loss of information in the dotted line. Like I guess all I'm saying is that the dotted line doesn't necessarily mean they're the same.
Yeah, sure.
It means some There could be
Yeah, I
some
just
ex-
wanted to understand that, like, it looks like what you're triangulating here is that, you know, some consistent form of excitement needs to take place, and it has like some internal cone, right, with the green arrows here, and then some mediated path through, let's say, just abstracting some relevant information. That information has some cone as well, and then you need to be able to connect the, let's say, excitement cone with the information cone.
Yeah,
And that's, let's say, the sort of double certification that, okay, that external excitement goes with this information, so I can kind of connect the two, right? Record the connection.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, no, yeah.
There's kind of a representation thing going on as well. Like you can say that the thing on the green dot on the right is a representation of the excitement on the left.
Yeah, dude, this is so like Freud's project for a scientific psychology. It just hurts my eyes. Like,
You can kind of like look at this and look at the old situationist procedures of like the detour and like the bricolage. It's kind of like scrambling capitalist memory. Then, like, if the city is arranged in a certain kind of way that starts to actually like transform these kind of landscapes of like how a city could be or whatnot into, like, you know, the kind of, what's his name, Hauptmann or whatever, that terraformed all of Paris, right? That there's a kind of memory that was inscribed, and that when they did their like little random walks and stuff, they were actually trying to like push against the way that memory was kind of shaping the landscape of people that lived inside of Paris. So that, like, at different levels, as you kind of zoom out on larger social aggregates, you can kind of see different ways that memory is like externalized and encoded and whatnot. Seems like you could do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, yeah, we can talk about like landscapes of a city, not landscapes like an internal representation, but like the actual, the architecture of a city as being a memory. But then the question is like, what are the co-regulators here? What are the receptors?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say like perhaps in the same vein, but a simpler kind of intermediate example, but still kind of abstract. It's just that these connections here, they share with the external object that they are material, right? For example, like a tissue, it's connected, right? It's not information. This is not an necessarily informational in the sense of like representation or abstract. You can just have like how something perturbs something else. Then there is something like an abstract kind of decantation of some perturbation, right? This is, let's say, the informative kind of taking in of that perturbation. And then there is the correlation between that perturbation and that information, that abstraction, right?
Yeah. So there's two bindings happening. The green arrows are the binding or the collective links. So there's the binding of the receptor. So like this sense or excitation binding, and then there's the binding at the informational or conceptual level, or however you want to call it, right? Like, so that, yeah, and these two bindings have to correlate in some way. Like, it has to commute. All these arrows have to commute. And then the final thing is this black arrow and the black dot, which is the actual record. So you have partial records, which you store it once in memory, and then they emphasize in the book that it has to, happen multiple times. You have to it has to persist in time for some duration before you can get a full record. So the full record is just the temporally extended version of the partial records.
So the kind of following from what we were talking about the other day, Dennis, about the idea of like limits as constraints and co-limits as almost action spaces, would that mean like the object that activates the receptor in this case is like the limit? provides the constraint? Because it seems like the initial.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, can you say that again?
Is the object the initial, like, is it the limit and the constraint and
The red thing.
initial object? Yes, the red thing. An object activates the receptors. So we have like kind of like a complete category here, right?
It's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess technically, yeah, this would be initial object because there's only one arrow from it to every other object. Yeah. Yeah, I guess it would be like a limit. Yeah. That makes sense to me. And then maybe the full record is a co-limit of everything.
It would be interesting to try to tie this back to some of the stuff Gabriel was saying last meeting that, to my mind, sounded like basically like using memory evolutive systems to ground how we make like periods in history, like how we define kind of like different segments according to their own like inner temporality and not. And it seems like you could kind of like almost like this applied on very large scales would be almost like how we kind of a bunch of things kind of repeat until they kind of like hit a level, and then we can say, okay, this time was about this thing, and we kind of infer from the process of the record being made back to the limit, the object, but we don't actually have like the object directly to kind of deal with. We're dealing with landscapes, and then the process of making partial records, which in a sense would be all the little informational acts we're all doing all the time, but also like following the idea of like city landscapes, all the other material formation. It's kind of like, I guess like the thing that would be interesting zooming out would be there's an arrow from the partial record process, the top left green, to the object that constructs a landscape. But wouldn't we then also like have a feedback over time from right to left? That seems like maybe where it starts to get more into like historical memory.
Where's the feedback coming from? It's coming from the
Right now, the dotted arrow is going from left to right, which
right.
That makes sense to me as far as like when we're talking about like memory as DNA, genetics, and neural memory and stuff. But when we start talking about historic memory with like, or also like the police bureaucracy example where we have like reflexivity explicitly built into it, then we also have another arrow coming from the right back to the left, which would be at the level of landscapes informing how partial records are made, so that by the time a co-limit is taken, it's taking the landscapes as well into it. Because right now in this diagram, the landscapes don't actually feed back into the partial record memory making.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. Yeah, I'm sure that would work in some way. I think the reason the arrows are this way is because later on, when you encounter the same object again, let's say another version of the red object, it's going to activate stuff in the same way. And you want to make sure that the same landscape object is activated when the perspective is also produced. So like it's more about I think that dotted arrow is there to allow for recognition of the same object again.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you're saying is more is instead of like recognizing that this object has appeared, you're talking more about like modifying or maybe digesting the object in a different way, which I think is also like allowed, but I just don't know how it fits into this. Like, I think this is at a lower level than that, maybe.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, it talks about it here, basically like records are multifold objects with long stability spans. They have both complexity and plasticity, meaning they can change, but still have some invariance in them, right? Like to your point, John, like historical memory, it's it needs to be plastic in a certain way because it has to be able to be reinterpreted. It needs to be able to change over time, but still capture the accounts of what happened, the various accounts. So you also need, you need to be able to recognize not only one object, but a class of objects together. So records need to be complex in that sense. And then you can have innate memory, which is what the system is born with, that then becomes complexified over time. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. I don't have, I also have to go now pretty soon, so I don't have much to add to this. But I think it's a good starting point for if we want to talk about things like trauma, things like collective efforts that require learning. Right.
Yeah, I think we could take like just a separate meeting to discuss this sort of aspect, because I find it like last time we already when discussed this, it seemed to me like there isn't such an easy move between, you know, individual memory and what this would mean, like what we call memory, like the role of memory for large collective political processes. I don't think it's what we usually call memory. Like, so probably it would require like a more detailed discussion, you know, just so we don't.
Yeah.
So anyway, just so not to get in the way of what you're saying.
The last thing I have here is this notion of extended minds, which kind of already we've been talking about this basically, but you with this notion of memory as being just another object in your system, you can start to build these extended mind scenarios where the memory is outside, like the Hegel example, right? It's like you don't need to carry memory with you. It can be embedded in other objects. So I put an example here. The art is itself like kind of a memory, intergenerational trauma, right? It doesn't really belong to any one individual. It's like something that's carried in your family. And recalling, when you recall something, it's like you're doing a ramification, right? So earlier we talked about ramifications as being like unfolding this object, but then we never really talked about what is unfolding the object, to say like, what are the underlying patterns of an object? And I think, I mean, they say this in the book too, I think, that when you recall something, you're not just getting one object out of memory, you're getting that object and all the patterns that make up that object, right? To some level, it's not like a full ramification, but it has some depth to it. So, and the reason it has depth is because you need those underlying patterns to be activated. So an example here would be like a musical piece played by an orchestra is a record, but it's never held in one person's mind. What you have instead is the pattern that makes up that piece of music, and that pattern is decomposed into the individual level. So each musician plays their own instrument, and then that translates into all the muscle memory and the different notes that they have to hit. So it's a ramification of the ultimate object, which the co-limit of all that is the musical piece, right? So yeah, if there's one thing to get from this slide, it's like when you remember something, it's similar to some extent as like an orchestra playing a piece of music. It's not like you just get one thing out of memory.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was talking to John on the chat, like I was reading when we were discussing extended cognition, a lot of papers on this phenomena of people who only recall things together, they don't recall it themselves. So for example, couples have access to memories when they're talking to the interviewer together, that they don't have access when they're talking separately. It has very much that feeling, right? Like you can only access it because there is a relation that is kind of, you know, from each standpoint that memory is activatable, but you don't have all the information on your own somehow.
Exactly. Yeah. I think this brings up the cool question of like, what type of relationships do you need to have with people to access memories that normally you would not be able to access? Like,
yeah, it sounds like transference.
Yeah.
That's really cool, man.
But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have. Like, thank you all for a very good discussion, and
No, it was amazing.
Yeah, no, this was really awesome. Thank you.
yeah,
Thanks,
I learned a
Andrés.
lot from just talking it through with y'all.
And I mean, I really hope we can. I think that idea would really work if we. I mean, we have some presentation. I think John is presenting next week, right?
Yes.
Then Vitor is presenting on his very interesting study on COVID treatments in Brazil during the pandemic. He's a really good investigative journalist. And then we have two presentations on the text we're publishing on Crisis and Critique, and then we could. I mean, I think it would be really good to return to your presentation and try to stitch that discussion back onto the concepts. You know.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna ask Juliano if he's up for moving the presentation on the 17th to the week after that, so that we can actually directly move, you know, from discussion of the text back to these concepts.
Okay, yeah, that works for me.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask him. I know he was he already was in doubt if he shouldn't use the next one, so it should work.
Yeah, and I like using the format maybe of this giant Figma file too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We could, I mean, in between now and then, we could already try to add some notes to this just to see if we can, you know, find connections.
Yeah, I'm thinking just like write down every example we can think of, and next to the pictures, that would be one
Yeah.
starting point.
Yeah,
Those
great.
diagrams are really nice, man. Thank you for putting all that together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
man. No, you're definitely our diagram artists now.
Thank you.
Anna, so nice to meet you. Hope you continue to join us. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm gonna make a point. I'm gonna come to as many of these as I can. Don't worry.
that would be amazing. And I mean, if we can convince you to present something on Stanford Beer, so we can learn some more
I
about
would
it.
love, yeah, I can even sort of start putting that together now. Like I know you'll probably have like a super intense schedule of like lots of people wanting to present stuff, but I'd love to like be thinking about maybe a presentation on VSM, Stafford Beer, maybe bring in some of the MES and like sort of work through some of that.
Well, that would be amazing. I mean,
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
I'm gonna, now that I have your WhatsApp message, I'm just gonna send you a message and we can talk
Yeah,
to
for
there.
sure.
I'll add you to our group if you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds great.
Great. See you guys.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.